In the vast expanse of space, where wars raged between countless species, humanity found itself at the brink of destruction. The galaxy had become a battlefield, with humans caught in the middle of an endless war. Despite their bravery and strength, they were losing ground to superior alien forces. The endless clashes left nothing but debris, ruined planets, and broken lives in their wake. Yet, amidst all the violence, there was one thing that humans possessed that no other species seemed to have: an unparalleled ability to adapt. They thought differently, acted unpredictably, and found solutions where others saw only problems. It was during one of the most brutal battles, as the humans were facing near defeat, that something extraordinary happened. A brilliant strategist, known only by a code name, had an idea. This idea was not about fighting harder or smarter. It was about stopping the fighting altogether. The humans had developed weapons, defenses, and strategies that could match any force in the galaxy. But what if they used their minds to create something far more powerful? Something that would not only stop the fighting but change the very nature of how war was fought. In a hidden laboratory on a remote moon, a group of the brightest human minds worked tirelessly, driven by a singular mission to end the war. After months of research, development, and testing, they created a signal, a code that could silence everything. This emergency code wasn't just a weapon. It was a force of peace disguised as something far more dangerous. Once activated, the code would trigger a deep silence, a silence so powerful that it would stop all noise, all communication, and all movement in the heat of battle. In that moment of stillness, soldiers on both sides of the conflict would be frozen, unable to make a sound, unable to fight. At first, no one believed it was possible. How could silence be a weapon? The idea was so strange, so foreign to their understanding of war, that even the humans themselves doubted its effectiveness. But desperation breeds innovation, and the team of scientists and soldiers who had developed this code were determined to try. They knew they were fighting for more than just survival. They were fighting for a future where war didn't have to be the answer. When the moment came to test the code, the atmosphere was tense. The battle was in full swing. Ships clashed, explosions rang out, and soldiers fought without mercy. With one final push, the code was activated. The universe held its breath as the signal spread across the battlefield. For a split second, nothing happened. But then, as if the universe had pressed a pause button, an unnatural stillness descended. All noise ceased. The booming explosions, the cries of soldiers, the hum of weapons, all of it disappeared. It wasn't just quiet. It was an eerie silence that swallowed everything. On the battlefield, the soldiers stopped in their tracks. They couldn't speak, couldn't hear the commands of their leaders, couldn't even move. It was as though time had frozen. At first, they stood confused, unsure of what was happening. They tried to shout, to scream, but their voices couldn't escape. Their weapons hung useless in their hands, their ships locked in midair, suspended by this strange, mysterious force. The alien soldiers, too, found themselves trapped in this silence. For the first time in the history of this war, no one could fight. No one could kill. As the silence stretched on, the soldiers began to question everything. What were they fighting for? In the stillness, their minds began to clear. The years of hatred, the endless battles, they seemed so meaningless now. How could they have been so caught up in something so destructive? And more importantly, why had they never thought of ending it like this? They realized, in that moment, that the war wasn't just about winning or losing. It was about survival, about fighting for the future. But what future was there if they continued to destroy everything in their path? The code had done what no weapon or strategy could ever accomplish. It had forced the soldiers to stop and think. But as powerful as the silence was, it was also terrifying. It wasn't just a moment of peace. It was a reminder of how fragile everything was. The very nature of war had been disrupted. And now, there was a choice to be made. Continue the fighting when the silence ended, or find a way to make this silence permanent. The code had only been meant to be a temporary measure, a brief pause in the violence to allow for negotiations or a chance for both sides to regroup. But in that moment of silence, humanity had done something unexpected. They had created a force of peace that could change the entire course of the war. The question now was whether anyone would embrace it, or whether the silence would become a weapon too powerful to control. As the minutes passed, and the stillness stretched on, one thing became clear: the universe would never be the same again. The signal, the code, had done the impossible. It had created a moment of pure, undeniable silence in the middle of chaos, and in that silence, humanity had found the power to change everything. What they had started as a desperate measure might very well be the key to ending the war, and the start of something far more profound. The first moments of silence were unlike anything anyone had ever experienced. It was as though the entire universe had held its breath, suspended in time. Soldiers stood motionless, staring at each other, unable to speak, unable to move. The deafening sounds of war, which had once seemed constant and inevitable, were now completely absent. The silence was so intense, it was almost overwhelming. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a calm evening. It was the stillness of a world frozen in disbelief. The humans, those who had initiated the code, stood in awe. They had expected some reaction, some change, but they hadn't anticipated the sheer power of the silence. It wasn't just a break in the fighting. It was a force unto itself, a force that rippled through the very hearts of the soldiers on both sides. At first, they didn't know what to do. In the silence, their voices were gone, their weapons useless. The battlefield, once full of chaos and fury, was now a ghostly scene of frozen soldiers. And then something unexpected began to happen. The human soldiers, standing at the center of it all, began to look around, their minds racing. In the eerie silence, the usual commands and orders from their leaders were absent. The constant flow of adrenaline, the drive to keep fighting, had evaporated. For the first time, the soldiers had the time to think, to really think. What was all this for? They had been fighting for survival, for victory, for honor, but now, in the silence, those reasons felt hollow. The battle seemed senseless. As their minds processed the silence, the soldiers began to question the very nature of the war. They had been trained to fight, to follow orders without question. But now, with everything paused, they were forced to confront the truth. They had been conditioned to fight, to kill. But why? What was the true purpose of all this violence? Was there a way out, a way to stop the endless cycle? Could this silence be more than just a break in the battle? Could it be the key to ending the war forever? The alien soldiers, too, found themselves in the same position. Their weapons, their ships, everything was locked in place, unable to function. They could see the humans across the battlefield, frozen just like them. In the silence, they, too, began to think. They had always believed they were the superior species, that their strength and technology made them invincible. But now, in this moment of silence, they were forced to confront their own beliefs. Why had they been fighting the humans in the first place? Was there a deeper meaning behind their struggle, or was it just another pointless battle for dominance? As the seconds stretched into minutes, the soldiers from both sides began to share a common realization. The silence was not just a tool to stop the fighting. It was a moment of clarity, a chance to see beyond the haze of hatred and violence. It was an opportunity to rethink their actions, to question their purpose. For the first time, they saw the futility of it all. The war, the killing, the destruction, it had all been for nothing. Back on the human side, those who had initiated the code watched with a mixture of hope and fear. They had always believed that the code was their last resort, a desperate attempt to force a moment of peace in the middle of chaos. But now, seeing the effects of the silence, they realized the power it held. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a turning point. It was forcing everyone to stop and think, to look at the bigger picture. It was asking the ultimate question: was the war worth it? For some soldiers, the silence was a revelation. They had never thought about peace before. The constant fighting had clouded their vision, and they had never questioned the reasons behind it. But now, in this moment of stillness, they saw the truth. The war was pointless. The death and destruction, the suffering, they had all been in vain. If they could only hold on to this moment, this peace, maybe they could find a way to end the war without further violence. But not everyone felt the same way. On both sides, there were those who didn't trust the silence. There were those who believed that the code, this emergency signal, was a trick. They had been fighting for too long, and the idea of peace, of silence, felt unnatural. They wanted to break the stillness, to fight again. The leaders of both armies were already making plans, quietly working to find a way to override the code and return to the war. To them, the silence was an enemy, a threat to their power and control. As the silence continued, the soldiers' emotions began to shift. Some felt a sense of hope, a desire to break free from the chains of war. Others felt frustration, the urge to return to the battle, to finish what they had started. In that moment, the silence was not just a break in the war. It was a battleground in itself, a place where ideas collided and clashed. The soldiers, frozen in time, stood at a crossroads. The silence had given them a glimpse of a world without war, without violence. But would they embrace it, or would they return to the only life they had ever known? The answer was not clear, and the future hung in the balance. As the minutes passed, it became clear that the silence was just the beginning. What happened next would determine the fate of the war, and the fate of the galaxy. The silence lingered for what seemed like an eternity, but it was only a matter of minutes. As the stillness held everyone in its grip, a deep underlying tension began to stir beneath the surface. The soldiers, on both sides, felt it. The realization that they were all part of something much bigger than their individual struggles had begun to set in. The emergency code, the strange silence, had forced them to pause, to think, but now the real question was emerging. Could they continue the war after experiencing this moment of clarity? Could they return to the violence, knowing how easily everything could be stopped? But not everyone saw the silence as a chance for peace. The warlords and generals, who had built their power and empires through endless conflict, were furious. They could not fathom a world without war. Their strength, their influence, came from their ability to control chaos, and the code had stripped that control away from them. The silence had humiliated them. They were not ready to lose their grip on the universe. If they allowed this silence to continue, if they allowed peace to take root, they would lose everything. Behind closed doors, away from the frozen soldiers, these leaders began to devise a plan. They would not let this peace take hold. They could not. They needed to break the silence, return to the war, and restore their power. A new alliance formed between the most ruthless and powerful factions of the galaxy, united by one goal: to override the code and ensure that the war continued. If they had to fight humanity's creation, if they had to risk everything to return to the chaos, they would do so without hesitation. Meanwhile, on the battlefield, the human soldiers were divided. Some were filled with hope, seeing the silence as a sign that they could end the war once and for all. Others felt the pressure of their orders and their duty to continue fighting. Despite the overwhelming urge to embrace the stillness, they were torn between the new vision of peace and the old ingrained habits of war. What was the right thing to do? Could they trust the silence, or was it just a fleeting moment? As the code held its grip, some soldiers began to communicate silently with each other, through subtle gestures and glances. They weren't sure what to do next, but they felt that something needed to change. They could no longer pretend that war was the only answer. They could no longer ignore the suffering that had stretched across galaxies, across civilizations. Maybe, just maybe, this silence could be the first step towards something better. But they knew they were not alone in their thoughts. Their enemies were already working against them, trying to end the silence and force them back into the endless cycle of violence. The alien factions, seeing the same opportunities and threats, began to take action. Their greatest minds, those who had once considered the silence a gift, now saw it as a weapon that could shift the balance of power. They began to work on finding a way to break the code, to override the emergency signal and return to their war. They had no interest in peace. To them, peace meant weakness, and weakness meant death. It wasn't long before the first signs of resistance appeared. A deep hum began to vibrate through the air, a faint signal that reverberated across the battlefield. The emergency code, it seemed, was beginning to falter. The warlords, with their advanced technology, had found a way to counteract the code's effects. Slowly but surely, the silence started to waver. The soldiers began to stir, their senses returning to them. The stillness, once so complete, was now fading. The human soldiers, who had grown accustomed to the silence, felt a deep sense of dread. They could feel the shift, the return of noise and chaos, and it made them uneasy. They had tasted peace, even if only for a few minutes, and now the prospect of returning to war felt unbearable. They didn't want to fight anymore. They didn't want to kill. But as the signal weakened, they realized that the silence was not something they could hold on to forever. The code, though powerful, was not invincible. The alien forces, sensing their chance, began to rally. Their ships powered up, their weapons reactivated. The leaders of the various factions gathered their forces, prepared to launch a counteroffensive. They believed they had won. They thought they had restored order, that the silence had been nothing more than a temporary setback. But they were wrong. The humans, now fully aware of what was at stake, made one final decision. They had to fight to preserve the silence, to make it permanent. They couldn't allow the warlords to take control again. In that moment, humanity found its strength. They had fought with weapons, with technology, and with strategies, but now they realized that the true battle was not about winning or losing. It was about protecting the peace that had been so fleetingly offered to them. They had to fight for something greater than themselves. The stage was set for a final confrontation. The warlords, furious at the loss of control, launched their forces in full force, determined to break the silence once and for all. The humans, with their new resolve, fought not just to survive, but to make the silence last. The universe watched as the greatest battle unfolded, not just for survival, but for the future of peace. The silence had proven that war could be stopped, that peace was possible, but now humanity would have to face their greatest challenge yet. Could they preserve this peace, or would the warlords destroy it for good? The fate of the galaxy rested on this crucial moment. The battlefield erupted once again, but this time it wasn't like before. The chaos was not just the clash of ships and weapons. It was the final struggle for control of a new world, one where peace had briefly taken root. The human soldiers, more determined than ever, pushed forward with everything they had. They fought not only to protect themselves but to defend the silence, to keep the peace that had begun to bloom amidst the destruction. The alien factions, still determined to restore the war, unleashed their most advanced weapons, knowing that if they could break the code, they could return to their reign of power. The skies above were a storm of fire and destruction. Ships twisted and turned, their weapons firing in bursts of light, creating a deadly dance in the void. But beneath the surface, the true battle was not fought with guns and ships. It was fought in the hearts and minds of those on the ground. Soldiers on both sides began to question what they were really fighting for. The warlords, still intent on crushing the silence, saw the growing resistance from their own troops. Some alien soldiers began to hesitate, unsure whether to continue the fight or stand down. The seeds of doubt were being planted, but it wasn't enough to stop the warlords. The warlords had one final weapon, a last-ditch effort to crush the peace. They had created a device, a signal that could override the emergency code entirely, rendering the silence powerless. If they could activate it, they would wipe out everything the humans had fought for and restore the status quo. The countdown had begun. But as the final moments ticked away, a new player entered the scene. A group of human scientists, working in secret during the battle, had discovered something incredible. They had found a way to enhance the code, to amplify its effects, and make it permanent. They realized that if they could activate their new version of the code, it would spread beyond the battlefield, across the entire galaxy. This time, the silence would be unstoppable, lasting for as long as necessary to bring peace to the galaxy. The problem, however, was that the new code was incredibly risky. It could either succeed in ending the war for good or backfire in a way that would bring even greater destruction. The humans had no choice but to trust their instincts. They activated the new code, sending the amplified signal across the galaxy. At first, nothing seemed to happen. The warlords continued to fight, and the soldiers clashed, unaware of the change taking place behind the scenes. But then, without warning, the galaxy itself seemed to hold its breath once more. The code spread like a wave, washing over every planet, every ship, every soldier. The silence returned. This time, it was no longer temporary. It was a permanent force, a force that could not be broken. For the soldiers, the effect was instantaneous. The weapons in their hands grew heavy, and their ships stalled mid-air. They could no longer hear the orders of their commanders or the battle cries of their enemies. The silence was now absolute. At first, confusion swept through the ranks. The soldiers tried to speak, to move, but nothing worked. The silence had become the dominant force. It wasn't just a break in the fighting. It was an all-encompassing reality. The warlords, too, found themselves trapped. Their final weapon, the one that had been designed to override the silence, was rendered useless. They could no longer control the battlefield. They could no longer control anything. As the galaxy fell into an eerie calm, the human soldiers stood in a kind of stunned disbelief. They had won, not through force, but through an idea. The silence, once a temporary measure, had become a permanent part of the universe's fabric. The warlords' power had been shattered, their weapons useless against the force of peace that humanity had unleashed. But even in this victory, there was still uncertainty. What would happen now? Could this silence, this peace, truly hold? There were no more weapons to fight with, no more battles to fight, but the cost of peace was still unknown. Would the galaxy embrace this new world, or would it push against it, seeking the chaos of war once again? As the silence spread across the stars, humanity's greatest challenge had only just begun. The war was over, but the true test lay in what came next. Could they rebuild a galaxy that had been torn apart by years of violence? Could they maintain the peace they had fought so hard to create? For the first time in a long while, the universe stood still, holding its breath, waiting to see if the silence would be the beginning of something new or the end of everything. The silence that had gripped the galaxy was unlike anything anyone had ever experienced before. It was as if the universe itself had been transformed into a vast, still ocean, silent and calm, yet undeniably powerful. The stars glowed quietly in the distance, and even the sounds of the distant battles had been reduced to mere whispers, now barely noticeable. For a moment, everything seemed frozen, suspended in time. The warlords, who had once believed their power was invincible, were now mere shadows in the vastness of space, powerless against the force of the code. Humanity's victory, achieved not through brute force but through the power of peace, had come at a great cost. There was no more fighting, no more war, but that left a new set of challenges in its wake. The silence was not just a break in the fighting. It was a fundamental shift in the way the universe operated. The galaxy, for all its power and might, was now caught in a moment of deep reflection, its people struggling to understand what the future held in a world without war. In the days that followed the final battle, there was a strange kind of stillness that spread across the galaxy. Governments and leaders, both human and alien, found themselves at a loss. Without war, what was there to govern? Without conflict, what was the purpose of their existence? The old systems of power had no place in this new world, and the silence made them feel irrelevant. For the first time in centuries, the people of the galaxy were free from the shadows of war. But that freedom came with a price of uncertainty. Humanity, however, had learned something in the moments of silence. They had learned that peace was fragile, that it was something that had to be nurtured and protected. The military leaders, who had once fought so fiercely for survival, now found themselves in a new kind of struggle, one to rebuild the galaxy and find a new purpose. The war was over, but the real work had just begun. Without war, without the enemy to fight, the question was, what could humanity do now? What would their role be in this new world? As the weeks turned into months, the humans began to realize something they had not understood before. Peace was not just the absence of war. It was the presence of something deeper, a commitment to understanding, to cooperation, to rebuilding. The silence had forced them to see the futility of endless fighting, but now it was time to see the value of cooperation. The leaders of the human factions gathered, no longer with the goal of fighting or protecting their lands, but with the goal of healing and rebuilding. Their unity, born from the silence, became their strength. And across the galaxy, the alien factions began to do the same. The warlords who had once sought power through violence and domination began to understand that the old ways no longer worked. They, too, faced the same dilemma. Without war, what could they offer to their people? What could they do with their power if it wasn't used to destroy? In the heart of the galaxy, the leaders of the once feuding species came together, forced into a new kind of cooperation by the silence that had altered everything. Slowly but surely, the building blocks of a new society began to take shape. It was not easy. Old habits died hard, and mistrust ran deep. But the silence had shown them a truth they could not ignore. If they wanted to survive, they had to change. They had to learn to work together, to share resources, to build a future that was not defined by violence. The silence had brought humanity and the alien factions to the same realization. War had been their undoing, and peace, though difficult, was their only way forward. In time, the galaxy began to heal. There were no immediate miracles. The scars of war ran deep, and the process of rebuilding was slow. But the silence, the code that had forced everyone to stop, had planted the seed for something better. It had shown them that peace was not just a dream. It was a possibility, one that had to be fought for, not with weapons, but with understanding and patience. As the years passed, the galaxy began to shift. The silence, though still present in the background, became less of a force and more of a reminder. It reminded the galaxy that peace was achievable, that they could live without constant conflict. The soldiers who had once fought on opposing sides now found themselves working together, building a future for their children and their grandchildren. The warlords, once the masters of destruction, had to adapt, learning the value of diplomacy and trade over the power of violence. In the end, the galaxy would never forget the silence. It had been the turning point, the moment when everything had changed. It was a moment of realization, a moment when the entire universe understood that peace was not just the absence of war, but a commitment to something greater. It was a commitment to building a future where no one had to fight for survival, where the silence was not a signal of defeat, but a symbol of hope. Humanity had created the emergency code not just as a way to stop the fighting, but as a way to open a door to a new beginning. The silence had forced everyone to stop and think. It had forced them to see the consequences of war and the possibility of peace, and in that moment, the galaxy had been forever changed.